March 24, 1945. 30,000 feet above Berlin, Germany. Captain Roscoe Brown is flying a P-51. P-51 Mustang. Red tail. That's how everyone recognizes his unit. The Red Tails. The Tuskegee Airmen, nicknamed for the distinctive deep red painted tails of their fighter planes. He's escorting B-17 bombers deep into German territory, the most heavily defended airspace in the world. His job: keep the bombers safe from German fighters. Suddenly, radio chatter erupts. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, German jets, the new Me-262s, fastest aircraft in the sky. Revolutionary technology, terrifying weapons. Brown sees them. 2 jets diving toward the bomber formation at over 500 miles per hour. His P-51 can barely do 400. He can't outrun them. He can't climb faster than them. But he can try to intercept them. He pushes his throttle forward. Full power. He positions himself between the jets and the bombers. The first jet flashes past. Too fast. But the second one, Brown leads it, anticipates, fires. His guns hammer. Tracers arc across the sky. The jet takes hits. Smoke. Fire. The pilot ejects. The jet spirals down. Brown has just become one of the first American pilots to shoot down a German jet in combat, flying a propeller-driven fighter against revolutionary jet technology, against impossible odds. And he's done it while protecting bombers that carry men who, back home in America, won't let him drink from the same water fountain. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American military pilots who formed the 332nd Fighter Group and 437th Bombardment Group. Men who fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany in the skies over Europe, and another against racism and segregation at home. This is the story of how they proved that courage has no color, that excellence knows no race, that the only thing that matters at 30,000 feet is whether you can fly and fight. This is the story of the Red Tails. Let's go back to before the war. 1940, America. The Army Air Corps had completely barred blacks from their ranks. Not discriminated against, completely barred. African Americans could not fly military aircraft. Period. The official justification? A 1925 Army War College study concluded that African Americans lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage required for combat aviation. This wasn't hidden. This was official policy based on pseudoscientific racism. So in 1940, if you were an African American with dreams of flying for your country, those dreams were impossible. You could serve in the Army, in segregated support roles. You could serve in the Navy, as mess attendants. But you couldn't fly. This was America. The same America that would soon be fighting a war against Nazi racial ideology. The irony was obvious to everyone except, apparently, the people making the decisions. But pressure was building. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, lobbied Congress. Black newspapers demanded change. And some politicians listened. In 1939, Congress passed the Civilian Pilot Training Act. It included a provision, inserted by advocates, requiring that training programs funded by the government couldn't discriminate by race. Not because Congress suddenly became enlightened, but because advocates fought for that provision and won. This opened a crack, a small crack. But enough. Enter Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically black college. They had an aviation program, and when the Army Air Corps was forced, absolutely forced, against their wishes, to create a program to train black pilots, they chose Tuskegee. Why Tuskegee? Partly because it had facilities, partly because putting the program in the segregated South, far from white communities, made white officers more comfortable. They could train black pilots without those pilots. Interacting with white society, the Tuskegee program began in 1941. The Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama trained the first African-American flying unit in the U.S. military. The men who volunteered knew what they were facing. They'd be under intense scrutiny. Any failure would be used as proof that the original policy was correct. That black men couldn't fly? They'd face hostility from white officers who didn't want them there. Segregation at every level. Housing, dining, facilities. They'd be fighting not just to earn their wings, but to prove that their entire race deserved the opportunity. One of the early cadets later said, "We weren't just learning to fly. We were representing every black American who'd ever dreamed of flying. That weight was on us every single day." The training was deliberately harsh. The Army Air Corps wanted the program to fail. They made the standards higher for Tuskegee cadets than for white cadets. The washout rate was intentionally increased. If a white cadet struggled with aerobatics, instructors might give extra training. If a black cadet struggled, they'd wash him out. See? They can't fly. But the Tuskegee cadets refused to fail. They studied harder, practiced longer, helped each other. Those who earned their wings did so knowing they'd overcome obstacles white pilots never faced. The first class of Tuskegee pilots graduated in March 1942. 5 men. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who would become the first black general in the Air Force, was in that first class. More classes followed. Eventually, nearly 1,000 pilots would train at Tuskegee. But it wasn't just pilots. The Tuskegee Airmen name also applies to navigators, bombardiers, mechanics, instructors, and support personnel. Over 14,000 people were part of the Tuskegee Airmen program. They trained on obsolete aircraft initially. Hand-me-downs, equipment white units didn't want. But they made it work, and all the while, they lived under Jim Crow segregation. Separate facilities, separate dining halls, separate everything. In their own country, training to defend that country. In 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron, the 1st Tuskegee Combat Unit, was deployed to North Africa. They'd fly P-40 Warhawks, ground attack missions, air support, combat. The first missions were hard. Not just the combat, but the reception. White bomber crews didn't want black fighter escorts. Some requested different escorts. Some officers tried to have the 99th reassigned away from combat. But the 99th kept flying, and they proved themselves. They flew combat missions in North Africa, Sicily, Italy. They shot down German aircraft. They destroyed ground targets. They did everything white squadrons did, and they did it well. But there were doubts. Official reports questioned their effectiveness. Some white officers claimed the black pilots weren't aggressive enough, weren't skilled enough. These reports ignored the facts. The 99th's combat record was solid, but racism doesn't require facts. Then came July 2, 1943, over Sicily. The 99th Fighter Squadron encountered a large force of German Focke-Wulf 190s, outnumbered. The 99th engaged anyway. They shot down multiple German aircraft, protected the bombers, returned home victorious. This couldn't be ignored. This was undeniable proof of combat effectiveness. The doubts began to fade. Not completely, but they started to fade. In 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group was formed. 3 squadrons combined, 99th, 100th, 301st, and later the 302nd. All Tuskegee-trained pilots. They were reassigned to the 15th Air Force to escort B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers using P-47 and P-51 airplanes. This is when they got their iconic look. The tails of their P-51 Mustangs were painted bright red for identification, so everyone would know. Those are the red tails. Bomber crews often requested to be escorted by these red tails, a nickname acquired from the painted tails of Tuskegee fighter planes. Why? Because the red tails had a reputation. They stuck with the bombers. Other escort groups might chase German fighters, looking for kills. The red tails stayed with the bombers. Protection was the mission. Glory was secondary. The 332nd flew 179 bomber escort missions. They lost bombers on only 7 missions, with a total of only 27 bombers lost to enemy aircraft, compared to an average of 46 among other 15th Air Force P-51 groups. Think about that. 27 bombers lost versus an average of 46. That's 19 fewer bombers. Each bomber had a crew of 10 men. That's 190 lives saved because the Red Tails were better at their job. This wasn't luck. This was discipline, training, dedication, and a refusal to let anyone say they weren't good enough. Let me tell you what it was like for a Tuskegee Airman in combat. You're flying escort over Germany. You're in a P-51, Red Tail. You're one of maybe 30 or 40 black pilots in the entire theater. Every white pilot, every bomber crew knows who you are. You know that if you mess up, it won't just reflect on you. It'll reflect on every black pilot, every black American. The pressure is immense. You're scanning the sky constantly, looking for German fighters, looking for threats to the bombers. You know that fighters from other groups might chase enemy planes for kills. But that's not your mission. Your mission is protection. A German fighter appears. BF-109, heading for the bombers. You intercept. You position yourself between the threat and the bombers. You engage. The German pilot is experienced. He's been flying combat for years. He knows tricks you've only read about. But you've trained harder than any white pilot had to. You've studied more. You've practiced more. Because you had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. You maneuver. You fire. The German breaks off. Damaged. He retreats. You don't pursue. The bombers are your mission. You return to formation. The bomber crew radios. Thanks, Red Tail. That's it. That's the reward. Knowing you did your job. Knowing you protected those men. Knowing that maybe, just maybe, you're changing minds about what black Americans can do. Let me tell you about some of the individual Tuskegee Airmen. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., first black general in the Air Force, commander of the 302nd. He faced racism his entire career. At West Point, white cadets refused to speak to him for 4 years. 4 years of silence, ostracism, hatred. He graduated anyway, became a pilot, led the Tuskegee Airmen with distinction, never complained publicly, never let racism stop him. After the war, he continued serving, eventually becoming a 4-star general. When asked how he endured the racism, he said, "I refused to let hate determine my actions. I flew because I loved flying. I led because my men deserved good leadership. The racists? They couldn't stop me unless I let them. Then there's Lieutenant Colonel Lee Archer, one of the top aces among Tuskegee Airmen. He shot down multiple German aircraft. On one mission, he engaged 6 German fighters single-handedly. He damaged or destroyed several, saved his bomber formation. After the war, he faced discrimination trying to find civilian flying jobs. Airlines wouldn't hire black pilots, so he became a businessman instead. Successful, but it shouldn't have been necessary. Captain Charles McGee flew 409 combat missions across 3 wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. 409 missions. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross multiple times. He lived to be 102 years old. Before he passed away in 2022, he was still inspiring young pilots, still telling the Tuskegee story. And there was First Lieutenant Mildred Hemmons Carter. Yes, women. The Tuskegee program included women as well, not as pilots in World War II, but as essential support personnel. Carter was a meteorologist. She briefed pilots on weather conditions. Her accuracy saved lives. She was one of many women who made the Tuskegee success possible. Now let me tell you about the mission that became legendary. The Berlin Escort. March 24, 1945. This was a maximum effort mission. The deepest penetration into Germany yet. Berlin, the German capital, heavily defended. German fighters would throw everything they had at protecting it. The 302nd was assigned to escort bombers to Berlin. The Red Tails would fly alongside white fighter groups, everyone watching to see if the black pilots could handle the most dangerous mission. The flight was long, hours over enemy territory, flak bursts, anti-aircraft fire, and then German fighters, including the new Me-262 jets, the Red Tails engaged. Dogfights at 30,000 feet over Berlin. Propeller planes versus jets. Experience versus technology. The Tuskegee Airmen destroyed 4 enemy aircraft without losing any of their own. Captain Roscoe Brown shot down that Me-262, one of the first American pilots to do so. All bombers returned safely. The mission was a complete success, and the Tuskegee Airmen had proven, beyond any doubt, that they were among the best fighter pilots in the world. Let me tell you about what they came home to, because this is where the story gets painful. World War II ends. August 1945. The Tuskegee Airmen return home. They've flown hundreds of combat missions. They've shot down enemy aircraft. They destroyed 250 enemy aircraft on the ground and 150 in the air. They've earned distinguished flying crosses. They've saved countless bomber crews. They expect respect, recognition, gratitude. Instead, they return to Jim Crow America. Segregation, discrimination, racism. They can't use white bathrooms, can't eat at white restaurants, can't stay at white hotels. In the South, they have to ride in the back of the bus, drink from colored water fountains. One Tuskegee Airman, still in uniform with his medals, was denied service at a restaurant. The owner said, "We don't serve your kind here." The pilot replied, "I just spent 2 years fighting for this country. I've been shot at by Germans, and now I can't get a cup of coffee." The owner shrugged. "I don't make the rules." That was America in 1945. Black pilots could risk their lives for their country. But they couldn't drink coffee in certain restaurants. Airlines wouldn't hire black pilots. Despite their extensive training and combat experience, major airlines had policies against hiring African Americans. Some Tuskegee pilots became crop dusters. Some gave up flying entirely. Some left America. After the war, the U.S. military was still racially segregated, and the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen were often overshadowed. Many of the airmen faced discrimination when they returned home, despite their service. But something else happened after the war. Something important. The success of the Tuskegee Airmen became impossible to ignore. Their combat record was undeniable. Their skill was proven. The racist justifications for segregation in the military looked increasingly absurd. How could you claim black men weren't capable when they'd just proven themselves in combat? How could you justify segregation when integrated bomber formations protected by red tails worked perfectly? The Tuskegee Airmen provided concrete evidence that segregation was based on prejudice, not performance, and that evidence mattered. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. It ordered the desegregation of the armed forces. The military would no longer be segregated by race. This didn't happen because Truman suddenly became enlightened. It happened because the Tuskegee Airmen and other black service members had proven segregation was unjustifiable. The order met resistance. Many white officers opposed it. Implementation took years, but it happened. And the Tuskegee Airmen were a major reason why. Let me tell you about a reunion that happened in 2007. Surviving Tuskegee Airmen gathered in Washington, D.C. They were elderly now, in their 80s and 90s. There weren't many left, but those who could travel came. They were there to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. Congress had finally recognized their service with one of the nation's highest civilian honors. One of the surviving airmen, now 87 years old, stood to speak. He said, "When we were young men, they told us we couldn't fly. We proved them wrong. They told us we weren't brave enough for combat. We proved them wrong. They told us we'd fail. We didn't. But the recognition, the honor, that came 60 years late. 60 years. Most of my friends didn't live to see this day. They died believing their service didn't matter to their country. I'm grateful for this medal, but I wish my brothers could be here to receive it too. They earned it more than I did. They just didn't live long enough to see America acknowledge what we accomplished. The room was silent, because he was right. Recognition came too late for most Tuskegee Airmen. They lived and died while their country barely acknowledged their achievements. Let me tell you about the myths and the truth, because the Tuskegee Airmen story has been mythologized. Some of the myths are positive but incorrect. Truth matters. The myth. The Red Tails never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. The truth. Enemy aircraft shot down at least 25 bombers they escorted. Nonetheless, that was a much better success rate than other escort groups of the 15th Air Force, which lost an average of 46 bombers. The myth persisted for decades because people wanted to believe it. The real truth is actually more impressive. The Red Tails' record was significantly better than their peers. They didn't need to be perfect to prove they were excellent. Another myth. The Tuskegee Airmen were immediately celebrated after the war. The truth. Most Americans didn't know about them for decades. Their story was largely forgotten or ignored until the 1980s and 90s, when historians and documentaries brought them back to public attention. And one more important truth. The Tuskegee Airmen weren't fighting for recognition or fame. They were fighting because it was their duty, because they loved their country despite how their country treated them, because they believed in something larger than themselves. Let me tell you about the modern legacy. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen are celebrated. There are monuments, museums, schools named after them, movies and documentaries. The red-tail P-51 is one of the most recognizable aircraft in American history. The Air Force Academy has a Tuskegee Airmen statue. New pilots are taught about their legacy, their example of excellence under pressure, their professionalism, their courage. Commercial airlines that once refused to hire black pilots now actively recruit diverse pilot candidates. The first black astronaut, Guyon Bluford, directly credited the Tuskegee Airmen with making his career possible. The first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, cited them as inspiration. But the Tuskegee Airmen would probably say the greatest legacy isn't the monuments or the fame. It's the young people, black, white, and every ethnicity, who see their story and learn that barriers can be broken, that prejudice can be overcome, that excellence speaks louder than hate. Let me tell you about Charles McGee one more time, because his story captures everything about the Tuskegee Airmen. McGee flew 409 combat missions across 3 wars. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Bronze Star. He was one of the last surviving original Tuskegee Airmen when he passed away in 2022 at age 102. In 2020, when he was 100 years old, he was honored at the Super Bowl. He received a standing ovation from 60,000 people. He was promoted to Brigadier General. Recognition that should have come 70 years earlier, but at least it came. In one of his last interviews, he was asked, "Do you have any anger about how you were treated?" He thought carefully. Then he said, "Anger? No. Disappointment? Yes, but anger is a waste of energy. We focused our energy on flying, on being the best, on proving wrong everyone who said we couldn't do it. We knew we were making history. We knew future generations would have opportunities we created. That was enough. That had to be enough. That's the spirit of the Tuskegee Airmen. Not anger, not bitterness, but determination, excellence, pride." Let me end with this. There's a saying among military aviators: there are old pilots and bold pilots, but no old, bold pilots. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that wrong. They were bold, flying into combat against determined enemies, and many lived to old age, telling their stories, inspiring new generations. But their boldness wasn't recklessness. It was courage, calculated, professional, disciplined. They were bold enough to challenge racism, bold enough to demand opportunity, bold enough to prove that excellence has no color. The Tuskegee Airmen, primarily African-American military pilots who formed the 332nd Fighter Group, flew with red-painted tails. Those red tails became a symbol, not just of a fighter group, but of courage, determination, and the ongoing fight for equality. 66 Tuskegee Airmen died in combat. They had one of the lowest loss records among fighter groups. They flew, they fought, they won, and they changed America. This is their story. The Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, men who proved that the only thing that matters in the sky is whether you can fly. And they could fly better than almost anyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And never forget, the Tuskegee Airmen didn't just fight for America. They fought to make America better. They fought to make America live up to its ideals. They succeeded, in the sky and on the ground. This has been WW2 Documents. Remember the Red Tails. Remember their courage. Remember that barriers exist to be broken. Fly high, fly proud. Like the Tuskegee Airmen showed us how.